بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
عليكم السلام.
First, of course, I would like to thank the IIIT for inviting me to share some reflections on the Arab Spring. But allow me not to dwell much on terms this time. Usually I try to clarify terms and concepts, but you will know what I will be talking about, because in the course of the presentation I will be defining exactly what I talk about. Terms like Arab Spring, Jasmine Revolution, Lotus Uprising, Unfinished Revolutions, Post-Arab Spring. These are all colorful and exciting terms, but of course are extremely debatable. What we are talking about here are uprisings that engulfed several Arab countries in an attempt from protesters, from people, indigenous people, native peoples, to seek freedom, dignity, and emancipation. And for me, what we are talking about, the key word about what we are talking about is emancipation and self-determination. I think this is the essence of the struggle that's going on in a number of Arab countries and Middle Eastern countries. To assess or to share reflections on the post-Arab Spring, I'm going to divide my presentation into 3 parts. The first part, I will try to assess the impact of the Arab uprising itself. And the second one, I will try to see where we are now after 3.5 years of uprising, revolutions, and counter-revolutions, and so on. And finally, where we are headed, where the region is headed in the future. When it comes to impact, of course, like most big major events, historians, sociologists, political scientists, of course, will debate for long the impact of these events and whether they have a long-lasting impact or they are simply have become something of the past. Let me state at the beginning, what we are examining today are not really revolutions. In order to understand objectively, so we really try to assess and get an idea of what we're speaking about, we are not talking about revolutions in the real term of the word. Why? Because revolutions usually build on a deep socio-economic conflict in society, or at least, if this socio-economic conflict does not exist, at least a very clear and strong ideological vision that can drive a country at least for decades or for centuries to come. Take the example of the French Revolution that had both the deep socio-economic conflicts and the vision of 3-4 slogans, 3-4 ideals that actually managed to set the course for an entire era. That's really a true era of liberty, fraternity, and equality. It's a humanistic or a human message in general. Another feature is the ability of revolutions and the desire of determination. Let's call it determination of revolutions to dismantle the existing structures and institutions. At least these 3, of course, people talk about violence, broad alliances, at least 12 criteria or requirements for a true revolution. Obviously, many of these criteria did not exist in the Arab uprising that we witnessed since 2011. At least they lacked 3 major elements: the ideology, and they always took pride in the fact that, for example, the Egyptian revolution or the Tunisian revolution was a transcendent revolution. These were transcendent revolutions, meaning that they go above ideologies, they go above religions, they go above classes, and so on, which might be also one of the weaknesses of these upheavals and uprisings. So they lacked the ideology, they lacked the avant-garde party, leadership. And I think we see it in Egypt, we see it in Tunisia, and elsewhere. There is this idea of pluralistic leadership or plurality in terms of the leadership of the movement, and actually people also took pride in the fact that this is a leaderless revolution. And when you ask them about the leadership, the sense of direction, the compass, usually they tell you the demands of that revolution is the leading and driving force. Matalib al-Thawra is the leading force. the demands of the revolution is the leading force, and so on. And finally, of course, the ability to dismantle the old system. So what we witnessed simply was mass popular movements that had to struggle in different political landscapes. Some succeeded in toppling the heads of regimes, like the case of Tunisia, Yemen, and Egypt, without necessarily dismantling the system itself. Some faltered or crushed early on, or later, at a later stage. The case of Saudi Arabia, uprising in Saudi Arabia early on in March, the Bahrain, and of course some turned into civil wars and chaotic situation, the case of course of Syria and Libya. Now, does that mean that the Arab Spring had some kind of anomic, sporadic uprisings and they just have become now something of the past? My answer is no. For a number of reasons. And this, for many analysts, will be very debatable and controversial, but because the extent and the nature of these uprisings combined both the anomic nature of unorganized upheavals and uprising, and at the same time also combined some features of revolutions, of classical revolutions, as I was saying. What happened in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, Yemen, and Syria, and the rest of the Arab countries since 2011 was, of course, historic and momentous. By all accounts, we witnessed an amazing demonstration of people power. This, in many cases, has been unprecedented. What we call the term the power of the street. The street as an arena for politics and for protest. The number of protesters that took place in some of these uprisings actually was unprecedented. The largest number was in Poland. 10 million people took the streets. In Egypt, according to the SCAF itself, the Supreme Council of the Army, I'm talking about 2011, some of the demonstrations in 2011, the number of protesters accounted to 15, and some accounts 18 million protesters. Yes, throughout the country and so on, and for a sustainable period of time. That's unprecedented. That makes them really the largest in terms of protest. Also, we also saw the youth and the ability of youth to mobilize huge numbers, millions of people for a sustainable or sustained period of time. We also saw a remarkable ingenuity in the use of the public space, the street as an arena for protest, as I mentioned, and also for other activities. People were, just having marriage celebrations, festivals, carnivals, musical shows, and at Woodrow Wilson, actually, we had two people that were doing research on the art of the revolution, like the artistic expressions of the revolutions and so on. So this, was, of course, was something very remarkable. Also, we witnessed the shift in the balance of power between authoritarian regimes and their respective societies, back and forth, like society winning for some time, and then, of course, authoritarianism making a backlash. Also, we experienced massive inclusive movements, the multi-class movements, with no ideological coloring, specific ideological coloring. You've always seen the photos in Egypt or other places of Christians and Muslims, or Copts and Muslims together in Tahrir Square. It was these kind of glorious high days of the protests. And finally, of course, the breakdown of the fear barriers and the restoration of hope for dignity. This is exactly what the Tunisians called their revolution. Thawrat al-Karama, the dignity revolution, or the revolution of dignity. These fear barriers are exactly also the thing that, for example, the coup leaders in Egypt are trying to reinstall fear into the hearts and minds of Egyptians, so they go back to this culture of apathy and acquiescence. Now, I said we had this kind of economic nature and also revolutionary, long-lasting nature, such as what? The diffusion effect. All revolutions have what we call the diffusion effect. The revolutions are not exportable. You cannot export a revolution, right? But you can. But the revolutions also have this kind of diffusion, ability to spread, to influence other peoples and so on. I think this was obvious how the revolutions spread very quickly from Tunisia to Egypt to Yemen to Syria to Saudi Arabia to Bahrain to Libya and so on. Within a matter of weeks. Most of them started February, March 2011. The geographic scope. If you look at the revolution, this is another characteristic of revolutions, that the revolutions have a wide geographic scope within the nation state itself. And if you look at Tunisia, it started in what they call the southern mining belt, in the southern eastern of Tunisia. You see the Mosaic, Kasrine, and so on, and then started to spread to urban areas. The same thing, if you look at the origins of revolution in Egypt, it starts at Mahalla. Mahalla, of course, is known as an arsenal for workers and for industrial bases and so on. So there is, and then from Mahalla and Suez. In January, it started actually, the first martyrs fell in Suez itself. So it starts from Mahalla, Suez, and then it takes a geographic expansion later on. Now, true that they have not, this Arab uprising has not exhibited a clear class consciousness, but at least they demonstrated a collective consciousness for the need to change the entire system. The slogan, الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. That's exactly the essence of the revolution. الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. The people demand, want to bring down the system. The entire system. This is exact and rebuild another system. Now, I just before leaving this point, and I know I'll be risking actually the time, there is, I think, very important idea that has to be mentioned here. Is this idea of breaking the Middle Eastern or Arab exceptionalism. If you remember, after the third wave and the fourth wave and so on, people started talking about this democratization wave, that the Arab people in the Arab world only revolt for bread. That's it. Nothing else. They never demand freedom, which is not true. It has never been true. They never demand freedom. They never demand free expression or anything. They only care about bread, or when their own respective governments allow them to protest or revolt against, for example, the United States or Israel, something like outside, an external enemy, but not inside. Now, of course, another element that, of course, one of the impact of the uprising was, of course, that ending this Middle Eastern, or the myth about Middle Eastern exceptionalism, and actually highlighting a fact that has been overlooked for a long period. If you look at the last 3 decades in the Middle East, 3 decades, that actually followed the collapse of communism, the emergence of democracies in Eastern Europe, and the spread of the wave of democratization worldwide, except in the Middle East. Look at these decades, the beginning of these decades, not necessarily by year, even though it coincides by year. Look at the beginning of each decade. What happened in the Middle East? Over a decade-long period. 1990, 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed 1989. The beginnings of a new restructured body of the Soviet Union started to take shape and so on. What was taking place in the 1991 in the Middle East? The Gulf War. A global war. Over 55, right? Or 36, sorry, 36 countries, international states, international countries waging a war in the Middle East. The birth of the New World Order, that was Bush took pride, the senior took pride and said the New World Order is being born here. Here was Kuwait. For a long decade, other parts of the universe, of the world, countries, they were just experiences with freedom and so on and so forth, and the Middle East was dragged into a long period or a decade of wars. And the 90s also was what? Coincided with what? The high days of globalization. All this onslaught of globalization and the need to integrate into the world economy and the world market and so on. 2001, the second decade, the first decade in the 2000s. The second 2001 coincided with what? 9/11. And then the war over, global war over terrorism against terrorism, the war over hearts and minds, and we need to change the hearts and minds of the Middle Eastern and so on, and this kind of, the whole integration of this region, regimes, people, and so on, into that direction. 2011, another decade, the third decade. 2011, 1991, 2001, 2011, the beginning of the Arab Spring, and January 30th, Blair on CNN declaring, and losing actually in a very emotional way, declaring that the West cannot stand still before the success of the Arab uprising, and the West should work to manage these uprisings. When a diplomat says manage, of course, that's a code word for whatever you like: control, crush, maintain, contain, anything. And he said it at least 3 times. Go back, CNN, around January 30th. In Egypt the uprising took place January 25th, 5 days. Because he knows what Egypt represented at that time also. Anyway, where are we now? The second part, where are we now? This is the most difficult part to assess. Because, of course, it combines a lot of emotions, aspirations, as I mentioned earlier, for emancipation, for self-determination, for freedom, exercise of freedom and dignity and so on the one hand, and on the other hand, the possibility of a setback, a major setback, and the return of authoritarianism in the Middle East and the Arab world. Steve Heitman talks about 2 developments or 2 types of developments that are taking place. He's talking about a backlash of authoritarianism, a return of authoritarianism in the region. And this authoritarianism is taking 2 types, 2 shapes. One is what he calls authoritarian upgrading, I'll explain them very quickly. And the second one is a more repressive authoritarianism. The upgrading one is an adaptive authoritarianism. Some regimes, in response to the uprisings and the pressures coming from below, they start to adapt very quickly, and their regime is an adaptation and so on. They use state spending in order to distribute benefits. And if you look, he actually shows a chart produced by the German bank that most Arab countries have increased state spending distribution since 2011 in order to fend off any kind or buy off protests. Remember this, the 30 billion, that was a very memorable figure, the 30 billion that the Saudi king distributed to the Saudi population immediately after January, in order to buy the protests and so on. So, more increased spending, appropriating reforms, some of the demands of the opposition. So this adaptive authoritarian systems, they start appropriating some of these demands. You want voting for women? We'll give women some voting rights and so on. You want some kind of parliament? Okay, fine, we'll appoint a parliament. They appropriate their demands. Co-opting, third, co-opting, containing or repressing civil society. That's, I think we see it almost everywhere. And finally, diversifying international linkages. Meaning that trying to get out of or to relive this kind of Cold War era of trying to play one superpower off against the other one. And you can see it, of course, this is of course imaginative or imaginable thing. You see it, of course, in the case of Syria, you see it in the case of Egypt and the desire to go to Russia and buy the Russian arms deal and all this stuff, trying to play one power against the other one. The second, of course, form is what he called repressive authoritarianism. And this actually refers to regimes that are willing to go in a civil war against their societies. Remember Libya, remember Syria, Egypt, and so on. They can go as far. This is another type. This is a very exclusionary type of system, very exclusionary. We are people, dividing the country into 2 peoples, 1 people and in, 1 people out, and even you can eradicate, you can kill, you can eliminate, annihilate the second people. the other people. They worship another god, we worship one god, all this nonsense and fascist rhetoric and so on. And then, of course, distribution also, but only to loyals, not to everyone, not to the entire population. Only distribution to or distributing benefits to loyal structures and institutions in the system. Allocations to specific elements or loyal structures. How am I doing with time? Okay, good. 10 more minutes. All right, good, very good, thank you. Now, what to do with these systems? Outside pressure is unlikely to work in this case, especially with this kind of fierce authoritarian type. Like if the Americans try to interfere, and I know they try to, or the Europeans and so on, it's not going to work. It's for them a battle for existence. And that's how they really articulate it. But of course, they do not articulate it around a new pharaoh or a new patron, but they articulate it around the continuation of the state. Dawla. In Algeria, before the civil war, they used to call it le pouvoir. So there's something. It doesn't refer to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and so on. No, it refers to the exercise of power and the core elements that really exercise power and control that power. And these elements have to be in control all the time. That's what they talk about. That these people are trying to shake the basis of the state, the fundamentals of the state. Therefore, they come up with narrative like the image of the state, or the symbolism that all related and affiliated with the state and so on. So it's a matter of existence for them. Having said that, their resistance and resilience, and that's where the contradiction might sound, but their resistance is not always guaranteed, as I will show you with figures. But before doing that, let me just do the narrative and then we'll go to the statistics. So one thing is outside pressure will not work with this authoritarian system. Sisi will not listen unless he feels individually, personally threatened. Bashar al-Assad will not listen until he feels also he's personally threatened. Short of that, it's a matter of obliterating any kind of opposition and crushing any threat that might, any potential threat that might arise. The second point about this, both systems, the adaptive and the repressive, they are rest mainly on coercive machine, instruments of coercion, and not on rational institutions that can ensure continuity and sustained support for the state. And this is a big, as you will see, and this is really a big point. This is an important point. Third, the underlying causes, because I know, I meet many Egyptians, I meet many Tunisians, Libyans, and so on. Everyone is, most people are in despair. The Arab Spring has failed, it turned into an Arab winter. It's a bitter, even winter. And what can we do? The authoritarian state is back, and so on. My idea here, I'm saying, yes, this might be true, but believe it or not, the underlying causes that behind the initial protests of 2011 are still there and still brewing, which means that these systems, all of these systems, are still sitting on a volcano that can erupt anytime. And that exactly is subject to the streets itself, the people themselves. Now, let me just, before I conclude, yes, I will just show you this. This is an index of failed states. And of course, it's a kind of a combination, like if you go to the website, the source is underneath here. You will just see it year by year. So what we did, we combined the years in order to find some kind of a pattern. And then we can draw conclusion from these patterns. This is an index of failed states in the Arab world and the Middle East. These are numbers. The numbers, the lower the number, like 1 is the most failed state out of 177. So Somalia, number one failed state. All right, 33 and so on and so forth. And of course, they have categories and classifications. But the most important thing is that this is based on really a huge set or multiples of indicators. You have 12 political, economic, and social indicators. Under each one, you have 14 indicators. So they combine all this, bring up numbers that will determine the status of each state. All right? So to a large extent, it could be politicized, but there are some kind of actually objective, empirical criteria that you can rely on. Literacy, access to human rights index, things like that, arrest, and so on and so forth. It's huge. Now, if you look at this, what you can draw, and this you can draw so many conclusions, just focus on 3 points. We're talking about from 2007, before the Arab Spring and after the Arab Spring. Some countries like Yemen and Egypt, for example, have been failed states for a long period of time. What do you draw from that? The idea that Arab Spring was a cause for failing, for the state to fail. That's not true. It's a myth. It might have affected that. But these states have been failing before the Arab Spring. That's one conclusion. And the proof here is, for example, Yemen and Egypt. Now, if you look at 2007 and 2014 for countries like Syria and Libya, these were far from being failed states. They scored very high in terms of stability, right? However, after the revolutions and so on, they went into failed states. The conclusion we can draw is repression can secure some kind of stability, but eventually cannot enable the system to remain in power forever. That's very logical. You can repress, and you seem to be stable. But this is very superficial because you can also fail once people rise up. It's very fragile source of stability that rests on coercion. This is exactly what most of the regimes are doing now. If you look at Syria, Syria is coercion, repression. If you look at Egypt, if you look at other places, they are resting on repression. If you look also into Tunisia, Tunisia is scored very high in terms of stability and managed to relatively recover even after the Arab Spring. And you can also take that as an indication of high level of education, strong institutions, and less poverty, better distribution system in a country. Okay? Anyway, there are so many things, but the main idea here is the idea of authoritarianism, whether adaptive or repressive, does not ensure stability, because in the end, this was the condition before 2011, that they used coercion and they still failed. At least one conclusion. Now, where we are heading, this is a conclusion. I want to stay from, like superficial indicators and so on in terms of trying to project the future, and stick to actually what we can call criteria, like clear, objective, empirical criteria that can really determine the direction of the course of history in the region over 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. So if I ask you, I know this sounds like very ambitious and so on, but it's doable. It's doable. Like people talk about the world after 100 years, but they use certain indicators. So if I use some indicators that are reliable indicators in the region, what can be like 3-4 factors that can really determine the trajectory, the course of history and events in the region? Population, demography, water and food availability, right? Whether we eat or not eat, based on the demography. You see the connection? It's very simple. The state of the economy and economies, how can we deal with these challenges? And how can we translate these needs into available, utilizing resources and make whatever we need available? And then finally, the nation state and the manageability of these systems, of these challenges. Okay. So 4 elements that I'm going to. Now, of course, I know I'm going to definitely run out of 2 minutes. On each one, I just talk like bullet points. If you look at the demography, we all talk about the youth bulge, right? Youth explosion. Everybody, every conference you go to, The Arab world, the youth in the Arab world constitute 65% from the age of 15 to 39. It became, you know, like a cliche everywhere you go. All right. Now, let me just refresh this with some figures. More than 60% of the region population is under 30. All right. Youth population in MENA is expected to reach its peak in 2030, meaning after 14 years or 15 years, and reaching 94, almost 100 million. 100 million, maybe 1/5, 20% of them. Now, median age, Middle East youth, and this is the most, I have so many figures, but this is, Middle East youth need 46 million jobs. 46 million jobs in order to reduce the unemployment level to the global level near 6%. I will show you that how that translates into economy. You need 46 million jobs in order to reach or to maintain the 6% unemployment level, the global unemployment, not the 13% or the 25% in countries or the 45% in some countries. Okay. Now, the second, I will connect all this. Now, water and food security. The average Arab citizen has 8 times less access to renewable water than the average global citizen. There is a huge water shortage. 12 Arab countries suffer from severe water shortages. How does that? I'm skipping. I'm just using like 1 or 2 pieces of information. How that translates into food. The Arab world is the most food import-dependent region in the world. It imports more than 50% of its food consumption and is by far the highest in the world. 2/3 of its needs of sugar, 50% of its needs of cooking oil, and 1/3 of dairy products. Okay. Now, according to the International Food Policy Research Institute, the food gap will increase, which obviously increases the vulnerability of that region to global food price shocks, the ones that we saw in 2008 and to some extent in 2010. So 2008 and 2010, these food, the hike in prices and so on. Now, how that translates into the economy? All these issues require a growth rate of 7.5% to 8% annually, which is almost impossible. Now they are growing at what? 3.7. 3.7. And just to show you the extent of the disaster that we're going through, Sisi declared that in 2 years it's going to double Egypt's GDP. We have never seen in human records in history a country that managed to increase by 50% in 1 year. We've never seen this. Not China, not Marsh, not anybody. He pledged to increase it, to double it in 2 years. Alright. Now, the disparities between rich and poor nations will persist, and this, of course, yes, but would be, and emerging democracies would be among the poor. And that shows you also the impact or the response from rich Gulf countries to the Arab Spring, and why they have taken this, because they know the democracies are going to be the poor countries. And the poor countries will have demands and so on and so forth. Now, that will constitute a major threat to democracy. Rising expectations, poor calling for social justice, rich calling for stability and growth and accumulation. There is a huge disparity between even the economic orientation that should lead the economic development and growth in the region in the future. Whether we go for distribution or we go for accumulation and growth. Now, to just show the extent, to address all this, again, the region needs greater trade integration, business regulations and government reforms, labor market and education reforms, improving access to finance, public finance reforms. Nobody has the time, or energy, or even will, or desire to do this. Everybody is concerned about stability, staying in power, fending off democracy and human rights and all these things. Now, the last point is the issue of ungovernability. Ungovernability. That might be too pessimistic, right? But I see it as a trend. This region could be one of the scenarios. They are very optimistic and very pessimistic. one of the pessimistic scenarios that we become actually, this region turns into the sick region of the world, like the Ottoman Empire, exactly. Like the Ottoman Empire. The collapse of an old system and the birth of a new system, but very turbulent system and very painful birth that is going to take place. So, when we talk about ungovernability, we're talking about weakened authority of nation states, and we see it. I'm not going to explain this because you can see it. We're talking about inability of the state to provide fundamental and basic services, electricity, food, security, water, employment, basic needs of the population. And we're talking about the presence or the increase in the presence of enclaves of terrorism and violence, because the authority of the state has collapsed. And we see this also spread. Now, in conclusion, finally, all these challenges need proper management and call for the emergence of efficient and accountable governments. Efficient and accountable government. They need a deep understanding that stability lies not in a dictator or in authoritarianism, but in democracy. Understanding that people have full right in self-determination, rule of law, and respect of fundamental human rights. Democracies cannot support regimes that are headed by military generals, violate human rights, and show no respect